4:14 in the morning. The Strait of Hormuz. 12 Iranian Revolutionary Guard speedboats were already closing in on the USS Halsey. They moved in a tight, aggressive formation, cutting through the black water of the Persian Gulf. This was not a standard approach. Usually, there were radio challenges. Usually, there was a predictable dance of shadow and light. Today, there was only silence. On the bridge of the American destroyer, the crew realized that the situation had shifted into something far more dangerous. The air over the strait was thick with salt and humidity. The surface of the water looked like polished obsidian. Below the bridge, the massive hull of the USS Halsey displaced thousands of tons of water as it moved at 15 knots. The ship was a billion-dollar platform of sensors and steel. It was designed to fight entire fleets. But against 12 small, fast, and agile motorboats at close range, its advantages were shrinking by the second. 4:16 in the morning. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Halsey, the blue light of the consoles reflected off the faces of the operators. A young sensor technician leaned forward. He watched the radar screen. 12 yellow icons were blinking. They were moving at 35 knots. They were less than 800 yards away. The technician spoke to the tactical officer. "Sir, targets are continuing their intercept course. They are not responding to our digital hails." The tactical action officer looked at the primary display. "Verify all channels. Try the bridge-to-bridge on channel 16 again." The communications officer shook his head. "Sir, I am getting nothing but static on every military and civilian frequency. The entire spectrum is dead." This was the anomaly. The silence was not just local, it was absolute. The USS Halsey was an Aegis-class destroyer. It was supposed to be connected to the world by a web of satellites and long-range high-frequency radios. Now, it was an island. 4:18 in the morning. Less than 500 yards away, Commander Abbas stood on the deck of the lead Iranian speedboat. He felt the warm spray of the Gulf on his face. He watched the gray silhouette of the American destroyer. It was a massive shape against the faint pre-dawn light. Abbas gripped the metal rail of the cockpit. His engines hummed with a deep, mechanical vibration. His radio was also silent. He had received his initial coordinates from a coastal station in Bandar Abbas 3 hours ago. Since then, his headset had provided only a low, rhythmic hum. He had no orders to fire. He had no orders to retreat. In the absence of communication, he followed the last directive he had received. He was to close the distance. He was to show the Americans that the strait belonged to his people. Abbas looked at the men on the spent boats to his left and right. They were young. They were armed with rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine guns. Some of the boats carried large, stabilized crates on their sterns. These were the remote-controlled explosives. At this distance, a collision would be catastrophic. 4:20 in the morning. On the bridge of the USS Halsey, Captain Miller stepped out onto the starboard bridge wing. He raised his binoculars. He could see the wakes of the 12 boats clearly now. They were less than 400 yards away. They were forming a circle around his ship. The captain spoke to his executive officer. "They are boxing us in. If we turn, we will hit one of them. If we stop, they will have a perfect firing solution on our waterline." The executive officer looked at the silent radio console. "Captain, we still have no word from Central Command. We are operating in the dark." Miller lowered his binoculars. He looked at the 12 targets. Each boat was a potential fuse. One mistake by a young sailor on either side would start a fire that no one could put out. "Sound general quarters," Miller said. "But tell the gun crews to keep their muzzles depressed. I do not want anyone thinking we are the ones starting this." The alarm began to chime through the passageways of the destroyer. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 4:23 in the morning. The sound of the general quarters alarm echoed through the steel skin of the USS Halsey. It was a rhythmic, urgent pulse. In the berthing areas, sailors rolled out of their bunks and into their boots. They moved with the practiced efficiency of a crew that had trained for this 1,000 times. but the air felt different. Usually, there was the chatter of the internal ship circuit. Usually, the bridge was relaying orders from shore. Now, there was only the mechanical hum of the ship. The master-at-arms took his position on the deck with a shotgun held across his chest. He looked out over the railing. The Iranian boats were so close he could see the individual shapes of the sailors on their decks. He could smell the exhaust from their outboard motors. It was a heavy, greasy smell that hung in the humid air. The 12 boats were no longer just following. They were drifting into a picket line, creating a physical barrier across the destroyer's path. 4:26 in the morning. On the lead speedboat, Commander Abbas felt the weight of his responsibility. He was 32 years old. He had a wife and 2 daughters in Bandar Abbas. He did not want a war, but he was a professional. He looked at his radio operator, who was frantically turning the dials on the communication set. Abbas spoke to the operator. "Is there any signal from the shore station?" The operator shook his head. "Nothing, Commander. It is as if the air itself has swallowed the signal. I cannot even reach the other boats in our group." Abbas looked back at the USS Halsey. He saw the movement of men on the decks. He saw the heavy machine gun mounts rotating toward his position. His men were looking at him for a sign. If he turned away, he would be a coward. If he moved closer, he might be a martyr. Without orders, he was trapped in the middle. He signaled with a hand gesture for his fleet to maintain their distance at 300 meters. 4:29 in the morning. On the bridge of the Halsey, the executive officer turned to Captain Miller. "Sir, we are attempting a visual signal. The long-range acoustic device is ready. We are also preparing the high-intensity searchlight." Miller nodded. "Do it. Let them know we see them. If the radios are dead, we use the old ways." The bridge wing searchlight snapped on. A blinding beam of white light cut through the pre-dawn gloom. It hit the lead Iranian boat, illuminating the spray and the faces of the crew in stark white detail. At the same time, the acoustic device sent a focused beam of sound toward the swarm. It was a high-pitched, painful siren designed to repel boarders without using lethal force. The Iranian boats did not flinch. They did not veer away. Instead, they accelerated. 2 of the smaller craft on the starboard side began to crisscross in front of the destroyer's bow. They were less than 100 meters away now. The USS Halsey was being forced to slow down to avoid a collision. The massive engines of the destroyer groaned as the propellers reversed pitch. The ship trembled as it fought its own momentum. The captain gripped the edge of the chart table. "They are testing us. They know we cannot maneuver in these narrows." A voice came over the internal bridge phone. It was the Combat Information Center. "Captain, we have a new problem. Radar is picking up more contacts. They are coming from the coast. Fast. Very fast." The situation was no longer a simple standoff. It was becoming an encirclement. 4:31 in the morning. Inside the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere was heavy with the smell of ozone and recycled air. The tactical action officer stared at the primary display. The 12 yellow icons representing the Iranian speedboats were no longer in a disorganized swarm. They were shifting. Each boat moved with a sudden, coordinated precision. They began to fan out, spacing themselves exactly 30 degrees apart. The officer spoke to his team. "They are forming a star. Look at the spacing. It is perfect." By placing themselves in a circle around the destroyer, the Iranian craft ensured that if the USS Halsey fired on one, the others would have a clear line of sight to her hull from every direction. It was a classic saturation tactic. It was designed to overwhelm a single ship's defensive systems. The destroyer was now at the center of a lethal perimeter. If the boats attacked simultaneously, the ship would have to engage 12 different targets at 12 different bearings at the same time. 4:34 in the morning. On the main deck, the 5-inch gun turret groaned as it rotated. It did not point at the boats. Instead, it pointed toward the sky in a neutral position. Captain Miller had been very specific in his orders. He wanted his weapons ready, but he did not want to appear aggressive. The crew worked in silence. Their hands were steady. Their eyes were fixed on the thermal cameras. They could see the heat signatures of the Iranian outboard motors. They could see the white-hot barrels of the machine guns on the speedboats. The gunnery officer reported over the internal line. Weapons are energized. The close-in weapon system is in standby. Tracking is active. We have a solid lock on all 12 targets. The close-in weapon system, or CIWS, was a 20mm Gatling gun. It could fire 4,000 rounds per minute. It was the last line of defense against incoming missiles and small boats. On the bridge, the display showed 12 small green boxes dancing over the Iranian craft. The computer was ready to fire. It was only waiting for a human to press the button. The sailors in the gun tubs gripped their mounts. They watched for any sign of a muzzle flash. 4:37 in the morning. The new contacts from the coast were now visible on the long-range radar. They were traveling at 50 knots. These were not small speedboats. They were larger. They were likely missile boats equipped with anti-ship weapons. The radar signature suggested they were C-800 and two capable platforms. These missiles could reach the USS Halsey in seconds once launched. The sensor operator spoke clearly. "Sir, the coastal contacts are closing at 50 knots. Range is 15 nautical miles. Time to intercept is 18 minutes. The USS Halsey was now caught. There were 12 speedboats at point-blank range. There was a second wave of heavier units approaching from the Iranian shore. The trap was closing. Without radio contact, the Americans had no way to ask for clarification. They had no way to warn the approaching vessels. The ship was effectively cut off from its chain of command. Captain Miller watched the countdown on his screen. The margin for error was disappearing. He could feel the vibration of the ship's engines through the soles of his boots. The destroyer was a powerful machine, but in these narrow waters, it was vulnerable. "Keep the cameras on those coastal contacts," Miller said. "I want to know the second they turn their fire control radars on us. If they lock on, we have to assume they are hostile." The silence in the room was absolute. Every man knew that the next 18 minutes would decide the fate of the ship. The star formation held its ground. The circle was tightening. 4:39 in the morning. The stalemate broke with a sudden roar of engines. One of the Iranian speedboats on the port side suddenly accelerated. 4:39 in the morning. The stalemate broke with a sudden roar of engines. One of the Iranian speedboats on the port side suddenly accelerated. It did not move toward the ship. It moved across its path. The small craft cut a sharp, white arc through the dark water. It was a classic thumping maneuver. It was designed to force the larger vessel to change course or risk a collision. Inside the bridge of the USS Halsey, the helmsman felt the ship lurch. "Captain, target 4 is crossing our bow. Distance is 60 yards. Closing." Captain Miller gripped the railing. "Steady as she goes. Do not give them the lane. If he wants to play chicken with 9,000 tons of steel, that is his choice." The Iranian boat was so close that the spray from its wake hit the forward windows of the destroyer's bridge. The American sailors could see the Iranian pilot looking up at them. He was not wearing a helmet. He was wearing a simple green fatigue jacket. For a heartbeat, the two crews stared at each other across a distance of less than 50 yards. Then, the speedboat skipped across the Halsey's bow wave and settled into a new position on the starboard side. 4:42 in the morning. The Combat Information Center was a hive of controlled aggression. The tactical action officer turned to the legal officer standing behind him. The target crossed within the minimum safety distance. It was an unsafe and unprofessional maneuver. Does that constitute hostile intent under the current rules of engagement? The legal officer looked at the screen. "Sir, hostile intent requires a clear indication of an imminent attack. A dangerous maneuver is a provocation, but it is not an act of war. We are still in the yellow. The yellow is getting very dark," the tactical officer replied. He looked at the status of the 5-inch gun. "If they do that again, we risk a physical collision. A collision could be interpreted as a kinetic attack. We need guidance from Central Command." The communications officer spoke up, his voice tight. "Sir, I am still cycling through every emergency frequency. Satellite link is still down. There is a total blackout from Bahrain to Hawaii. We are on our own." 4:45 in the morning. The isolation was the most dangerous weapon in the strait. Without a link to higher headquarters, the captain was the sole authority for the United States in these waters. He had the power to start a war. He also had the responsibility to prevent one. Commander Abbas, on his lead boat, was facing the same crisis. He watched the American destroyer. It was a silent, gray mountain. He knew the Americans were disciplined. He knew they were waiting for him to make the first move. He also knew that his own superiors in Tehran would expect him to be bold. In the silence of the radio, the silence of the sea, and the silence of the command chain, the weight of history rested on the shoulders of two men who could not even speak to one another. Abbas raised a hand. He signaled his boats to move in closer. The star formation began to contract. The circle was now only 200 yards wide. The speedboats were so close that the Halsey's secondary guns could no longer depress low enough to hit them. The Iranians had moved into the dead zone. Captain Miller watched the movement on his tactical plot. They are inside our minimum engagement range for the main battery. They know exactly where our blind spots are. A new sound began to rise over the hum of the engines. It was the sound of metal sliding against metal. On the decks of the Iranian boats, the sailors were pulling back the canvas covers on their heavy weapons. 4:47 in the morning. The canvas covers came off. On the decks of the 12 Iranian boats, the movement was synchronized. Dark metal gleamed under the ship's searchlights. The heavy machine guns were manned. The Russian-designed 12.7mm guns were swung toward the bridge of the USS Halsey. Beside them, sailors held rocket-propelled grenade launchers. The tapered, olive-drab warheads were clearly visible through the high-resolution cameras of the destroyer. Inside the Combat Information Center, the imagery was magnified on the main screen. The sensor operator pointed to the screen. "Sir, they are manned and ready. I count 12 heavy machine guns and at least 6 RPG teams. They are tracking our bridge and our flight deck." Captain Miller watched the feed. The Iranians were no longer just shadowing the ship. They were preparing for a kinetic engagement. The rules of the game had changed. The presence of the rocket-propelled grenades was a specific threat. While they could not sink a destroyer, they could devastate the bridge or the sensitive radar arrays. They could blind the ship before a larger attack. 4:50 in the morning. Two of the speedboats were different. They did not have machine guns on their bows. Instead, their entire midsections were dominated by large, rectangular containers covered in blue tarpaulins. The hulls of these specific craft sat lower in the water. They were heavy. They were reinforced. The wake they left behind was deeper and more turbulent than the others. The tactical officer adjusted the zoom. "Captain, those are the suicide configurations. We estimate at least 500 pounds of high explosives in each hull. They are positioned at our 4 o'clock and 8 o'clock. They have a clear path to our midships." The USS Halsey was now surrounded by a mix of suppression fire and precision demolition. If the machine guns opened up, the American crew would be forced to take cover. In that moment of distraction, the two explosive-laden boats could strike. It was a sophisticated, low-tech solution to a high-tech opponent. 4:52 in the morning. Captain Miller felt a bead of sweat roll down the back of his neck. His jaw was set tight. He looked at the rules of engagement card tucked into the side of his console. The words were clear. He had the right to use proportional force to defend his ship from an imminent threat. The uncovering of weapons and the positioning of explosive craft met every criteria for hostile intent. Every officer in the room was looking at him. They were waiting for the command to arm the close-in weapon system. They were waiting for the order to engage. Miller knew that if he fired, he would kill dozens of men in seconds. He would also likely trigger a response from the coastal missile batteries. The silence from Central Command was a vacuum. He was alone with the decision. "Hold your fire," Miller said. His voice was steady but hard. "Do not even cycle the ammunition belts. We give them no reason to flinch." 4:53 in the morning. On the lead Iranian boat, Commander Abbas watched the American destroyer. He saw the 5-inch gun remained elevated. He saw that the Americans were not yet pointing their main weapons at his men. He respected the discipline, but his own men were nervous. One accidental discharge from a heavy machine gun would end the standoff. The tension was a physical force. It was a wire pulled so tight it was hummed. Abbas looked at his watch. The second wave of boats from the coast would arrive in 7 minutes. When they arrived, the American captain might lose his nerve. The window for a peaceful resolution was closing. The morning sun began to bleed over the horizon, turning the sky a deep, bruised purple. The light did not bring clarity. It only showed how close the two sides really were. 4:55 in the morning. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Halsey, a new sound cut through the tension. It was a high-pitched, warbling electronic tone. It was the sound of a threat. Every operator froze. The electronic warfare technician shouted over his shoulder, "Captain, we are being painted. Fire control radar. Shore-based. 6 o'clock. An Iranian Silkworm missile battery on the coast had just locked its radar onto the destroyer. This was the final step before a launch. The ship's defense systems responded automatically. The decoy launchers on the port and starboard sides turned toward the threat. The air was electric. The crew was seconds away from a kinetic exchange. 4, 56, and 30 seconds. The tactical officer looked at Captain Miller. "Sir, we have a solid lock from the shore. The two suicide boats are accelerating. They are breaking the star formation. They are making a run for our midsection." On the monitors, the two heavy boats with the blue tarpaulins surged forward. Their bows rose out of the water as they pushed through the waves. They were less than 300 yards away. They were moving at 40 knots. At this speed, they would impact the hull of the USS Halsey in less than 15 seconds. Miller's voice was a low growl. "Arm the CIWS. Master, arm to hot." 4:57 and 15 seconds. On the deck of the destroyer, the close-in weapon system mounts whirred into life. The white, dome-shaped turrets tracked the incoming boats with terrifying speed. The radar inside the domes locked onto the small, fast-moving targets. The sound of the electric motors was a high-pitched whine. The 20mm Gatling guns were now slaved to the radar. They were ready to spray 4,000 rounds of tungsten per minute into the path of the suicide boats. 4:58 in the morning. On the lead Iranian boat, Commander Abbas saw the American weapon systems activate. He saw the white domes moving. He looked at the two suicide boats. They were not responding to his hand signals. They were operating under a different set of orders. Or perhaps they had no orders at all. Abbas grabbed his signal flare gun. He pointed it at the two boats. He fired a red star shell into the air. It was a desperate command to abort. The red light reflected off the water. The suicide boats did not slow down. They were now at 150 yards. 4:58 and 45 seconds. The tactical officer on the Halsey had his thumb on the firing stud. 200 yards. Target is closing. Permission to engage? Miller watched the screen. His heart hammered against his ribs. Wait. 150 yards. Captain, we are at the limit. Wait. 100 yards. 4:59 and 30 seconds. The entire world narrowed down to the space between the gun barrels and the approaching hulls. The machine gunners on the other 10 speedboats leveled their weapons at the Halsey's bridge. The shore-based radar signal was now a steady, lethal drone in the headsets of the electronic warfare team. The countdown to a massacre was at 0. The lead suicide boat was now so close that the American sailors could see the spray hitting its windshield. It was at 75 yards. The CIWS was tracking perfectly. The barrels began to rotate. 5 o'clock in the morning. 5 o'clock in the morning. The pivot was not a command. It was a wall of steel. Out of the gray morning haze, a massive silhouette emerged from the north. It was the Al-Sadiq. It was a 300-meter-long, liquefied natural gas tanker. It was traveling at 18 knots, following the deep-water channel that ran directly between the USS Halsey and the Iranian coast. The civilian vessel was a mountain of iron. It was unaware of the lethal standoff occurring in its path. 5 o'clock and 15 seconds. The physical presence of the Al-Sadiq changed the geometry of the battlefield. As the tanker moved into the gap, it stepped between the USS Halsey and the shore-based radar. The electronic warfare technician on the destroyer shouted, "Captain, we have lost the lock. The tanker is masking us. The Silkworm battery is blinded." The massive hull of the tanker acted as a shield. It was a physical barrier that blocked the electronic eyes of the Iranian missile crews. At the same time, the tanker's bow wave began to roll toward the smaller speedboats. A wall of water, 3 meters high, surged outward from the Al-Sadiq, 5 o'clock and 30 seconds. The two suicide boats were less than 50 yards from the USS Halsey when the tanker's wake hit them. The small craft were tossed upward like toys. Their engines roared as the propellers left the water. One boat slammed back down into the trough of a wave, burying its bow and taking on hundreds of gallons of water. The second boat was forced to veer sharply to the right to avoid being sucked into the tanker's massive propellers. The suicide run was broken. The physical reality of the sea had done what diplomacy could not. The two heavy boats were now struggling to remain upright in the turbulent water behind the tanker. 5 o'clock and 45 seconds. On the bridge of the USS Halsey, Captain Miller watched the Al-Sadiq slide past. The tanker was so close he could see the rust on its hull. It smelled of heavy fuel oil and sea salt. It was a moving fortress of commerce, cutting through the center of a potential war zone. Miller saw the opportunity. "Helmsman, hard to port. Use the tanker's wake as cover. Get us behind her stern." The destroyer leaned into the turn. The 9,000-ton ship responded with surprising agility. It slipped behind the massive shadow of the Al-Sadiq, putting 30,000 tons of explosive natural gas between itself and the Iranian speedboats. 5-0 to 1 in the morning. On the lead Iranian boat, Commander Abbas watched his formation dissolve. The wake of the tanker had scattered his fleet. 3 of his boats were dead. In the water, their engines stalled by the massive displacement. The 2 suicide craft were falling behind, struggling with the weight of their cargo in the rough water. Abbas looked up at the Al-Sadiq. He realized that for the next several minutes, he could not see the American destroyer. He could not fire on it without hitting a neutral civilian tanker carrying a cargo that would vaporize everything within 3 miles if ignited. The tactical situation had flipped. The hunters were now separated from their prey by a giant they could not touch. 5-0 to 2 in the morning. The immediate threat of a collision or a suicide strike had passed, but the tension remained. The USS Halsey was now masked, but it was also pinned against the western side of the channel. The Iranian boats were regrouping on the eastern side. The silence of the radios continued. The blackout was still in effect. Captain Miller wiped the sweat from his forehead. He looked at the executive officer. "The tanker just gave us a breath of air, but she is moving at 18 knots. In 5 minutes, that shield will be gone." The executive officer checked the sensors. "Captain, the Iranian coastal boats are still coming. They are 5 minutes out. We have a very small window to find a way out of this." The morning light was finally here. The sun was a pale, cold disk on the horizon. The Al-Sadiq continued its slow, steady transit, oblivious to the fact that it had just stopped a war. 5-0 to 4 in the morning. The wake of the Al-Sadiq was a chaotic churn of white water and rolling swells. The USS Halsey maintained its position directly behind the stern of the massive tanker. For the first time in an hour, the American destroyer was not the most visible target in the strait. The physical bulk of the civilian vessel acted as a thermal and radar shield. The heat signatures of the tanker's massive engines masked the smaller, hotter signature of the Halsey. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tactical officer watched the display with intense focus. "The tanker is giving us a 300-meter shadow. The Iranian speedboats on our starboard side are trapped in the wash. They are struggling to maintain steerage." Captain Miller stood by the helmsman. "Keep us tucked in. I want us to stay in their blind spot as long as possible." "What is the status of the coastal contacts?" The sensor operator adjusted his headset. "The 2 missile boats from the coast have slowed to 30 knots. They are searching. Without their shore-based radar lock, they are having trouble separating our return from the tanker, but they are still closing. Range is now 8 nautical miles. 5-0 to 7 in the morning." On the lead Iranian speedboat, Commander Abbas felt the violent pitch of the sea. His boat slammed into a deep trough created by the tanker's displacement. Water flooded over the gunwales, soaking his men and their equipment. He looked back toward the rest of his swarm. The star formation was completely broken. 2 boats were drifting, their crews frantically working to restart engines stalled by the heavy spray. Abbas wiped the salt from his eyes. He looked for the American destroyer, but it was gone. It had vanished behind the wall of the Al-Sadiq. He knew the Americans were still there. He knew they were using the civilian ship as a tactical screen. He felt a moment of professional respect for the American captain. It was a clever move. It had used the geography of the Strait and the reality of commercial traffic to neutralize a superior local force. But the situation was not over. Abbas looked toward the horizon. He could see the silhouettes of the 2 missile boats from the coastal command. They were larger, faster, and carried enough firepower to overwhelm the Halsey if they could find a clear shot. He signaled to his remaining functional boats to regroup on the eastern edge of the channel. He needed to find the destroyer before the missile boats arrived. 5:10 in the morning. The Al-Sadiq was clearing the narrowest part of the channel. The distance between the tanker and the USS Halsey began to grow. The shield was moving away. As the gap widened, the morning sun climbed higher, illuminating the gray hull of the destroyer. The concealment was ending. Captain Miller watched the tanker pull ahead. "We are going to be in the clear in 60 seconds. Executive officer, what is the status of our communications? Do we have anything?" The communications officer looked up from his console. His face was pale. "Sir, still nothing. But I am seeing a spike in the noise floor. It is not natural interference. It looks like a high-altitude burst of localized jamming. Someone is intentionally keeping this zone silent." The realization hit the room like a physical blow. This was not a mechanical failure. This was a coordinated effort to force a confrontation. The USS Halsey was being pushed into a fight while its eyes and ears were taped shut. "Ready the countermeasures," Miller said. "If we cannot talk to our command, we will have to talk to the Iranians directly." The tanker moved forward, leaving the destroyer exposed in the open water. The Iranian speedboats were already turning back toward them. The second wave was less than 6 minutes away. 5:12 in the morning. The protective shadow of the Al-Sadiq was gone. The giant tanker continued its slow, indifferent journey toward the open sea, leaving the USS Halsey exposed in the center of the North Channel. The 12 Iranian speedboats had already begun to regroup. They moved with a renewed aggression, their wakes crossing and recrossing as they surged back into their star formation. The distance was closing again. 300 yards, 200 yards. Inside the Combat Information Center, the noise of the jamming was visible on the spectral displays. It looked like a solid wall of white noise, drowning out the satellite links and long-range arrays. But the electronic warfare technician noticed a flicker. The jamming was high altitude and broad spectrum, but it was not perfect at the surface level. There was a narrow window in the low-frequency bridge-to-bridge band. It was a tactical hole in the interference. The technician turned to Captain Miller. "Sir, I have a clear channel on bridge-to-bridge 16. It is low power. It will only reach the boats within 3 miles, but it is open." 5:15 in the morning. Captain Miller took the handset, looking out at the lead Iranian boat. He could see Commander Abbas standing in the cockpit of his craft. The 2 men were less than 200 yards apart. The American captain clicked the transmit button. Captain Miller spoke into the radio. "Iranian patrol craft. This is the captain of the United States ship Halsey. You are approaching a United States Navy vessel in international waters. Your current maneuvers are unsafe and unprofessional. I am ordering you to break away immediately." There was a long pause. The static hissed in the background, a dry, rhythmic sound. Then, a voice came through the speaker. It was calm. It was professional. Commander Abbas responded. "United States ship Halsey. This is the Iranian commander. You are within a restricted zone of the Strait. We are conducting a lawful intercept. Why have you been silent for the last hour?" Miller tightened his grip on the handset. "Our command frequencies are being jammed. We have been unable to communicate with our headquarters. I suspect your command is facing the same silence." 5:18 in the morning. On the lead speedboat, Commander Abbas stared at his radio. The American's words hit him with the force of a physical blow. He looked at his own radio operator, who nodded silently. They had been in the dark since the start of the mission. Abbas had assumed the Americans were the ones jamming the signal to mask their movements. Now, he realized the silence was a trap set for both of them. Abbas spoke into his microphone. United States ship Halsey. We are also experiencing a total blackout. My orders were to intercept any vessel in this sector. I have 2 missile boats arriving in 4 minutes. They are operating under the same orders. Captain Miller's voice was cold. If those boats fire, I will be forced to defend my ship. The result will be a war that neither of us was ordered to start. I am requesting that you stand down your suicide craft. Now, 5:20 in the morning. The 2 men watched each other across the narrow stretch of water. It was the ultimate test of professional restraint. If Miller was lying, Abbas was giving up his tactical advantage. If Abbas was lying, Miller was leaving his ship vulnerable to a lethal strike. On the deck of the lead Iranian boat, Abbas raised his hand. He made a sharp, downward motion. He then spoke into a handheld short-range radio, bypassing the jammed long-range sets. The 2 heavy boats with the blue tarpaulins suddenly cut their throttles. Their bows dropped as they lost momentum, falling back and away from the Halsey's midships. The suicide run was over. The 10 remaining speedboats began to widen their circle, increasing the distance to 500 yards. The immediate fuse had been pulled, but the 2 coastal missile boats were still closing at 40 knots. They were now less than 4 miles away. They did not have the visual context of the bridge-to-bridge conversation. They only saw an American destroyer in a restricted zone. Captain Miller let out a breath he had been holding for 20 minutes. The suicide boats are standing down, but we are not clear yet. Those missile boats are the real threat. The morning was bright now, the sun reflecting off the water with a blinding glare. The crisis had shifted from a knife fight to a long-range standoff. 5:22 in the morning. The 2 Iranian missile boats appeared on the horizon as sharp, dark silhouettes against the rising sun. They were larger than the speedboats. They moved with a predatory grace, their bows cutting through the swells at 40 knots. On the bridge of the USS Halsey, the electronic warfare suite began to scream. The chirp of the radar warning receiver was a steady, high-pitched alarm. The coastal boats had locked their fire control radars onto the destroyer. Inside the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere was frozen. The tactical officer looked at the display. Sir, we have 2 solid locks. They are in a firing position. If they launch, we have less than 30 seconds of reaction time. Captain Miller picked up the bridge-to-bridge handset again. Abbas, your missile boats are painting us. They are seconds away from an engagement. Talk to them, now. 5:25 in the morning. Commander Abbas did not hesitate. He knew that the arrival of the coastal boats was the final tripwire. He grabbed his short-range, low-power radio. This was a tactical set used for ship-to-ship coordination within the swarm. It operated on a frequency that the high-altitude jamming had not yet smothered. Abbas spoke with an urgent, commanding tone. Vector 1, Vector 2. This is Commander Abbas. Disengage your fire control. The situation is under control. Do not fire. I repeat, do not fire. The Americans are not hostile. We are in a communications blackout. Stand down. There was a long, agonizing silence. On the horizon, the 2 missile boats continued their high-speed run. Then, the electronic screaming inside the Halsey's bridge suddenly stopped. The radar warning display turned from red to green. The coastal boats had broken their lock. They slowed their engines, their bows settling back into the water 2 miles away. 5:28 in the morning. The tension that had held the Strait in a vice for over an hour finally began to crack. Abbas fired a green signal flare from his lead boat. It was the universal maritime signal for all clear. One by one, the 12 speedboats turned away from the USS Halsey. They moved in a disorganized line, heading toward the eastern horizon. The 2 suicide boats followed them, their heavy hulls moving slowly through the receding wake of the tanker. On the bridge of the destroyer, Captain Miller watched them go. He did not feel relief. He felt a profound sense of unease. The threat was gone, but the mystery remained. "They are peeling away," the executive officer said. He sounded breathless. "The missile boats are turning back toward Bandar Abbas." Miller nodded. "Secure from general quarters. Set condition 3. Let the crew get some breakfast. But keep the sensor teams on high alert." 5:30 in the morning. The USS Halsey was alone in the channel again. The Al-Sadiq was a small dot in the distance. The Iranian fleet was a fading memory on the radar screen, but as the communications officer checked his consoles, he looked back at the captain with a grim expression. "Sir, the ghost silence is still in effect. Satellites are down. Long-range radio is down. We are still completely cut off from the world." The battle had been avoided by the restraint of 2 men, but the force that had tried to start it was still out there, silent and invisible in the morning sky. The USS Halsey continued its journey through the Strait, a billion-dollar warship that was, for the moment, entirely alone. 8:30 in the morning, 3 hours after the encounter. The USS Halsey had cleared the narrowest part of the Strait of Hormuz. It was now in the deeper, more open waters of the Gulf of Oman. The morning sun was high and relentless, turning the sea into a vast, shimmering mirror of blue and silver. The ship was no longer at general quarters, but the tension in the wardroom was visible in the tired eyes of the senior officers. A sudden, sharp electronic chirp echoed through the bridge and the Combat Information Center. It was a sound that had been missing for over 4 hours. The satellite link indicator on the primary console turned from a flashing amber to a solid, steady green. The communications officer nearly shouted, "Captain, we are back online. Signal strength is at 100%. The data burst is coming through now." 5 minutes later, the printer in the corner of the room began to hum. Page after page of urgent messages from the Pentagon and Central Command spilled out. They were not just asking for a status report. They were demanding to know why the USS Halsey had vanished from the global tracking system at the exact moment an Iranian naval group had also gone dark. 11:15 in the morning. The initial analysis of the ghost silence was distributed to the senior staff. It was more disturbing than the standoff itself. The jamming had not been a local Iranian effort. It was a sophisticated, high-altitude electronic attack. A series of localized, low Earth orbit satellites had been temporarily blinded by a coordinated cyberstrike. This strike had erased a 50-mile circle around the Strait of Hormuz from the world's digital map. The tactical officer read the report. "Sir, it was a zero-day exploit. Someone used a backdoor in the maritime communication protocol." Captain Miller leaned against the chart table. "And they did the same to the Iranians. They created a dark room and put 2 armed men inside it. They wanted us to trip over each other in the dark." The realization was a cold weight in the room. The standoff had not been an accident of geography. It had been an engineered crisis. The goal was not a tactical victory. The goal was a strategic disaster. If one missile had been fired, the resulting war would have closed the strait for months, crashing the global economy and drawing half the world into a conflict that neither side had authorized. 2:45 in the afternoon. The diplomatic cables began to arrive. A secure, high-level line had been established between the State Department and the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Both nations were officially blaming each other for the provocation. But behind the public rhetoric, there was a different conversation happening. The technical data from the USS Halsey and the logs from Commander Abbas's boats were being compared by neutral third-party analysts. The data confirmed the truth. Both commanders had been operating without oversight. Both had been pushed toward a cliff by a force that neither side could identify. The Hormuz deadlock was becoming a case study in modern asymmetric warfare. It showed that the most dangerous weapon in the 21st century was not a missile. It was the ability to take away a commander's ability to think and communicate. Captain Miller walked out onto the bridge wing. He looked back toward the strait, which was now a thin, dark line on the horizon. He thought of Commander Abbas. He wondered if the Iranian was also standing on his deck, looking at the same horizon. They were enemies by policy, but they were allies in the fact that they had both chosen not to fire. "The world almost ended this morning," the executive officer said softly, standing beside him. "The world ends every day," Miller replied. We just happened to be the ones standing at the door today." 3 days later. 1:30 in the afternoon. The Pentagon. In a windowless briefing room deep within the ring of the Pentagon, a group of senior intelligence analysts sat around a mahogany table. The air was cool and smelled of floor wax and coffee. On the large digital display at the head of the room, a map of the Strait of Hormuz was frozen in time. A red circle indicated the zone where the USS Halsey had gone dark 72 hours earlier. The chief of naval operations looked at the lead cyber analyst. "The forensic report is complete. Tell me what we are looking at. Was this a state-sponsored attack?" The analyst adjusted his glasses. "Sir, we have traced the source of the jamming. It did not originate from Tehran. It was a distributed denial-of-service attack on the satellite uplink, triggered by a malware package that had been dormant in the global maritime tracking system for 6 months. The origin is a stateless group, a collective of high-level hackers with no clear national affiliation. They didn't want a victory for either side. They wanted the conflict itself." The room was silent for a long moment. The implications were staggering. In the age of digital warfare, a third party could now manufacture a world-scale crisis between two nuclear-capable powers without firing a single shot. They had used the natural tension of the Strait as a laboratory for chaos. 10:15 in the morning. 2 days later, the United States Naval Academy. Captain Miller stood at the podium in a lecture hall, filled with midshipmen. He was in his dress whites. His face was tanned from the sun of the Persian Gulf, but his eyes were weary. He was not there to talk about the power of the Aegis weapon system. He was there to talk about the power of the human mind. Miller looked out at the young faces. "The most advanced computer on the USS Halsey is the one sitting between your ears. On that morning in the Strait, every system we trusted failed us. Our radios were dead. Our satellites were gone. Our sensors were being fed a false reality. In that moment, the only thing that stood between a routine patrol and a global war was a choice. A human choice." He paused, looking at his notes. "The Iranian commander and I were enemies on paper, but in the vacuum of that silence, we became two professionals who understood one simple truth. The cost of a mistake is too high for the world to pay. We chose to trust our training over our fear. We chose restraint over reaction. Modern warfare is often described by the speed of our missiles and the precision of our lasers, but the most critical weapon in our arsenal remains the ability to say no." 5:45 in the evening. The Strait of Hormuz. The sun was setting again, casting long, golden shadows across the water. A different American destroyer, the USS Carney, was making its transit through the North Channel. The crew was on high alert. The memories of the Halsey's near miss were fresh in their minds. Far to the east, a small group of Iranian patrol boats sat on the horizon. They watched the American ship pass. There was no aggressive maneuver. There was no closing of the distance. For now, the Strait was quiet. The strategic assessment was clear. The Hormuz deadlock had shown both nations that they were vulnerable to a type of war they were not yet prepared to fight. A war where the greatest enemy was not the person on the other side of the radar screen, but the person who could make that screen go dark. The water of the Persian Gulf remained a deep, dark blue. It was a place of ancient history and modern tension. It was a narrow corridor through which the lifeblood of the global economy flowed. And as long as men stood on the bridges of gray ships, watching each other through binoculars, the world would rely on their judgment. The morning of the silence was over, but the lesson remained. In the high-stakes game of geopolitical chess, the most powerful move is sometimes the one you never make. No missiles flew. No ships were lost. History had shifted not by the force of an explosion, but by the weight of a decision. The sky turned to black. The stars appeared, cold and distant over the quiet sea. The Strait was open. The world was at peace. For now,